But the thing I most often find myself coaching people on is communication and narrative. So
Mm,
much about your performance in the workplace is about telling a story.
yep.
I'm in meetings all the time where see people saying, well, this didn't work because, or, you know, um, oh, I have an idea. The best thing you can do to help yourself if you are working with an executive is have a
Mhm,
clear story. The
mm,
results are X. I am going to take the following actions. Here's a
mhm,
model. I'm an analyst, but in my view, here's a model for how the results will change as a result of that. And that's
mhm.
how we hit our targets.
Welcome to the Maximus podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Cam Sapa. As a clinical psychologist, medical school professor, and CEO, I specialize in helping men be better in mind, body, and masculinity. On this podcast, I interview extraordinary men as a clinician would, hearing their come-up stories of how they became the men that they are today, and having them share their secrets of actionable advice on how to look, feel, and perform your best. All right, we are back with part two of our podcast with Jeff Weiser, who has led marketing at Shutterstock, Beachbody, and Shopify, and is now a consumer investor in a private equity firm. And this portion of our segment we like to call actionable advice. So in part one, we spent a lot of time kind of learning your story, kind of growing up, your professional and educational development to get you to become the man that you are today. And now we want to kind of focus a little bit on like the techniques and kind of routines that you use to be an effective, individual, husband, professional, etc. So maybe some place we can start is I know there's no typical day, especially having been in your shoes as an investor. But can you walk me through at least a prototypical day in terms of like your kind of routine and how you kind of spend a typical day?
Sure. I'm trying to think of what the contours of a basically normal day are because it's hard. But I would
As
say,
normal as it can be, I guess.
yeah, the morning is just a cluster, right? Our alarm goes off at 7. By then, at least one of my two kids, sometimes both, are in our bed.
Yeah.
Not because they've come in the morning, but like sometime in the middle of the night. My kids wander in. I have two girls; they're 6 and 7,
Mhm.
and so about as close together as kids come without being twins, which was interesting when they were babies, but great now. So that's just sort of a rush to get at least 3, sometimes 4 people out the door. So breakfast,
Right.
getting the kids dressed and fed, and get everyone out the door. They have to be walked to school these days.
Mhm.
There's no taking the subway or a taxi or anything like that,
Right.
and dropped off at 8:30. So that's a rush. I'll give you a normal COVID day. From there we typically go to work, but in a normal COVID day, everyone's working at home, and so
Sure.
I'm back by 9, and my wife is either already here or vice versa. She's taking the kids, and I'm home. And then we are in different rooms, working all day.
Right.
My wife has this is probably important to point out, has a career that's as demanding and serious as mine. And so it's not like we have a parent who's at home to do the errands and take care
Yeah.
of the kids and stuff like that. But we retreat into our separate rooms. My wife uses the
Mhm.
office. I'm often in our bedroom, and
Yeah.
my workday is a mix of things. That's part of what's great about this
Mhm.
role. I'll spend some time on the phone with portfolio companies, either working on part of a larger strategic initiative that we've together formulated, or with folks who just have a quick question here or there. They want a marketing consultant, they need a referral for a piece of technology, something like that. Often spend part of the day with our investing teams, listening to pitches from companies, meeting with management teams. Probably some portion of the day reviewing data or creating artifacts in service of supporting an investment or executing against it.
Mhm.
By around, uh, well, I usually at around 5 try to exercise for about an hour. Sometimes
Mhm.
that's around 6. I live in a building in the city, and so there's a gym. During COVID, only one
Nice.
person can use it at a time, and you're apparently supposed to work out also wearing a mask, even though you're in there by
Sure.
yourself. So there's a form to fill out. I work out. I've been doing. I found these incredible workouts that are really strength training, but rooted in yoga.
Huh.
That I've been doing. So I do those. Then back to work for a couple hours. By 7:30, my wife and I are usually both done working. We have a
Yeah.
nanny during the day. Our nanny goes home. Then we bathe the kids, get them in bed, read to them. My younger one's out by 9. This is such a boring day. And then, my older one is like a short sleeper, even though she's only a
Right.
year older. She'll read in bed with me, until 10 or 11. And then she goes to bed. And then my wife and I go to bed. My wife often works until like, 1, 2 in the morning, which I'm an early bird. She's a night owl.
Yeah, nice. Well, I mean, it sounds like an incredibly packed and productive day. I'm curious. Have you, especially in the adaptation to COVID, have you sort of learned any tips or tricks in terms of, keeping your balance, keeping your sanity, even though you're all kind of locked up together?
Separate space definitely helps.
Yeah,
I don't care how much you love your family. You need to, there's something, that brings sanity about going to a place during the day and doing your work. So that's certainly helpful. Um, I was going to say something about this. Shoot, I lost the train of thought, but the question was about whether COVID taught me. Oh,
just
I
adapting to
think
this
that
new.
a lot of families will tell you that as much suffering as there is in the world, and as horrible as this
Hmm.
time is, that there were real silver linings. I think
Yeah,
about when COVID first started, and people weren't even having nannies come in, and people fled the city. There were, no one was
right,
even in my building. We went and rented a house way out on the tip of Long Island, and we wiped down every package with
right.
sanitizer, like everyone did. But we were having dinner together every night as a family, and the forced proximity definitely had silver linings to it. And so just finding a touch point every day to spend as a family, I think, is really good. And then I just thought of the other one that I was going to say. For me, I like to get outside, and the risk with
Yeah,
COVID is that you might not. And so, very lately, even though it's not usually something we compete for, but rather to not do, I've been saying to my wife, I'll walk the kids to school, because getting some
yeah.
sunlight and like a 30-minute walk, which is what it takes round trip, first thing in the morning, even when it's been about 30 degrees in New York, is really nice. And so I just think, sort of making a commute for yourself and getting some early in the day sunlight is probably a good.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I've actually, read some articles about this and even heard this from some of the clients that I work with that even though they're totally working from home, they've almost like recreated a commute it's totally unnecessary. It's like they do a lap and they end up back in the same place. But the interesting thing that they report is that one, obviously, they get their their physical activity, which is critical. That's the biggest thing that I've seen actually is because I quantify a lot of this for my clients. There's been probably a 50% reduction in step counts and physical activity from people. Even if you drive or to work, you're still walking around like your city or getting from the parking lot to the office versus literally sitting in the same bedroom where you eat, sleep, and do your Zoom meetings. It goes to almost zero, right? So I think that's been huge for physical activity. I'm glad that you point out the sunlight as well. That's obviously very helpful for vitamin D production and our well-being. But then the third, and I think the underappreciated part to your point is I think there's a useful psychological buffer to beginning and ending every day, right? To transition from, it's like, okay, I'm taking care of the kids to, okay, now I'm at work. That in this COVID situation almost happens immediately versus if you even have 15 minutes of space to be like, all right, what am I going to work on for today? Let me get back into the professional mindset. Or conversely, at the end of the day, to kind of leave those concerns and work stresses at home so you can come and be fully present with your family is invaluable. So I think it's a great lesson, to share.
What you're really doing in those scenarios, you're context switching, and we all have
Hmm.
lesser forms of it when you go from meeting A to meeting B. But I think you're right. Pivoting from your personal life to your professional life is probably the biggest context shift of the day. And so,
Right.
getting some space and maybe signaling or cueing it in your mind with a physical difference of location or something like that is probably very valuable.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, especially with this job that you have, you work with many different portfolio companies, and you have all kinds of different tasks that you're doing, whether it's investing or evaluating or helping out. How do you kind of keep your do you have a productivity system essentially that you can help keep track of all of these things, know what to work on, how to prioritize?
There are two things that I've increasingly done over time. I was never an especially organized person. I had a very good memory. And so
Mhm.
up to a certain point I could remember everything. Now I
Yeah.
don't I like to believe, at least, that in my early 40s my memory is not failing me, but I did reach a certain point when I went from managing like, call it 20 people to,
Yeah.
to north of like 80 people. I reached a certain point where it just was impossible to keep track of all the work streams that were
Sure.
happening. Doesn't matter how good your memory is.
Right.
You might assign people to do things and then just forget. And so at that point, I started taking really copious notes. Now I'm using the Microsoft Teams app, OneNote, which has a really good filing structure. I'm told
Yeah.
Evernote is good too, but it doesn't really cost you much to jot down what's going on in different areas. And especially if you have an organizing structure to it, I think that's
Mhm.
really helpful. I've toyed with lots of different mechanisms for to-do lists and for prioritization. I really haven't come up with anything better as a companion to those fairly
Mhm.
copious notes than having, a separate sheet where I list the top things. I usually do it in buckets. There are things
Mhm.
I need to do maybe for diligence and investing, things I need to do for operating portfolio companies, but then I'll also have a list of things that need to be done personally, and that might be
Mhm.
subdivided into things that are for the kids, things that are for the home, or
Mhm.
whatever. I really haven't gotten to a better to do system than that. I've tried creating flags and
Mhm.
tasks in email programs, but the notes and the to do list seems to work pretty well for me.
Amazing, and I think your point about especially copious notes is well taken. I think there was an era where people used to do that a lot more. Now in the era where everything is recorded, I think we think we like to, it's like, oh, I'll record it. And it's like you're not going to go back and listen to 60 minutes, but the nice thing about notes is you can at least go back, skim through it, or find the parts, or especially now in the digital age, you can even search it, right? So I think that's a very valuable lesson.
Yeah, the only times I don't do it are when you really need to be hyper present. In
Mm.
private equity, there's more firm meetings and partner meetings and team meetings where you're not the primary speaker all the
Mhm.
time. As a CMO, if I knew that I was going to be too engaged to take notes myself, I would often ask someone else to do it. Like, who's
Mm.
going to take notes on this meeting? So I don't think it
Right.
always has to be you, although your recall will always be better when you refer to things you
Sure.
typed, not only because you use your own language and your own shorthand, but because the act of recording it itself embeds it in your memory.
Yeah, that's a great point. Um, and so on top of this productivity system, you have your notes, you have your to do list. I'm kind of curious, especially since it sounds like you're going kind of from morning to night. How do you manage your stress? I know you mentioned the evening workout, which is probably really critical. Uh, I'm curious how you kind of pick your kind of strength based yoga routine. Is it because it is helpful for stress management, and is there anything else that you do that you find it effective for managing your stress?
Yeah, I don't know that I do these things specifically as a targeted stress reduction mechanism, but
Hmm.
I've noticed through correlation over time that there are three things. I'll extend it to four.
Hmm.
There, because one of them is a little harder to control, but there are three things that when I'm doing them the most, I am the least stressed. And they are
Okay.
exercise for sure. I mean,
Yep.
you're well aware there are studies now, exercise is more powerful than antidepressants. I totally believe that would be true. I just, I think there's nothing you can do that's better than, a hard workout just about every
Right.
day. Second one is reading
Mm.
and reading fiction for me. I know a lot of people read
Interesting.
business books or how to's. Like to me, that's a little close to home in terms of what
It's more
the
work.
the day to day is. I don't know that I view that as enough as escapist enough. Maybe it's for
Yeah.
me, it's fulfilling the role of TV in a certain way. But
Mm.
reading fiction for me, it enlarges the world.
Yeah.
And in a true escapist way, I think brings you outside of yourself. So that is a huge one. I've toyed on and off with, but very recently, like within the last 2 months, have really committed to meditation.
Mm.
And, I've gotten up to doing it like about 30 minutes a day, which I don't know, feels like a
Okay.
lot to me, especially when you struggle,
No, for sure.
you struggle to focus on your breath for 3 seconds. And my observation now is you got to find a program you like. I had flitted in and out of different ones. At some points, I was just using timers in my old brain. I'm now using the Sam Harris app, Waking Up,
Yep.
which
I've
I
heard
think
good
is
things.
a really good one and sort of scientifically oriented. Or maybe it's large. Maybe it's his credibility from being a public intellectual that
Hmm.
cast it in that light. But that's really a great one, and I just decided to follow it. Day in, day out.
Hmm.
And like going into the second month, I really started to first see the benefits. But I think it's one of those things that you really need to do it and do it every damn day
Yeah.
to really start seeing benefits. So those would really be the three. I think the fourth one is getting a lot of sleep. That's the one I say
Yeah.
you can't always really control. Like you're
Sure.
busy, kids wake you up, like, shit
Yeah.
happens. But I always notice I feel the least stressed when I'm the most rested.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that, by the way, because I've actually like written about this publicly on Twitter and stuff, and talk about how important sleep is to executives. And a lot of people just like poo poo it, and they're like, oh, like how many successful C-level executives do you know that are actually sleeping a lot, or certainly not if they have kids. So I'm glad we have a C-level executive with two kids who says sleep is important, and at least I do my best to try to prioritize it. So I think it just goes to show that it is really important. I'm also curious. You mentioned the picking up the meditation habit. A lot of people have certainly, hopefully, heard about meditation and the benefits. What have you actually noticed? Because you're 2 months into it, which is like a really critical kind of. It's just like starting a new exercise routine. Have you noticed whether psychologically, physically, or otherwise, like any improvements or benefits that you can point to,
I think
or
the
just feel
biggest
better?
one, most of our the internal monologue in most of our brains is a constant
Mhm.
stream of forecasting what might happen in the future, reflecting on what has happened in the past, and it's not always in the most positive light. And I
Right.
think that, meditation, by training you to be in the present moment, lets you create those present moments more frequently. So,
Mhm.
Sam Harris's advice is like, great, you do this for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes a day, whatever it is, but look for moments where you can just take a beat, and see things as they are. Check in with what you're feeling like, and what your attitude is, what your mental state is, and things like that. And I've noticed that more often I'm just like taking that pause to say like, what's going on here, really, and that sort of stops runaway narratives in your brain from taking over. And I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you mentioned too about kind of finding a form or program that you resonate with, right? There's a lot of options out there. There's Waking Up is a great one. Kevin Rose has one called Oak. Headspace and Calm are obviously very big consumer companies in this space. 10% Happier, Simple Habit, Aura. These are all the ones that I even looked at as an investor. So there's a proliferation of them. I think the VA even has one called Mindfulness Coach that's free, that they originally developed for veterans. It's actually evidence based, but you can use it as well.
By the way,
And
one thing
one
to
of
know, if anyone's investing in meditation and trying, there
Mhm.
came a point, believe it or not, because I never thought this would happen, and it was probably after about 20 or 30 days doing it consecutively, where I came to crave the feeling of meditation, meaning it started to actually feel good to have completed a meditation. And I think that was a
Interesting.
turning point when like I could finish and say, oh, I feel better for having done that.
That's a great point because I think a lot of people are deterred, especially guys, from meditation because they consider it uncomfortable or boring, quite frankly, right? That it's almost like an aversive stimulus. But I think kind of once you get over it, and there's lots of ways of doing it. By the way, I do find some clients they don't like sort of sitting down, and so I encourage them to do like a walking meditation. And in fact, that even comes from the Buddhist tradition too. It doesn't necessarily have to be like sitting in a lotus position, eyes closed, if that's not what appeals to you. So you certainly can do a walking meditation, an open awareness meditation, as opposed to focusing on the breath. You can just kind of take in your surroundings, and when you notice the thoughts naturally arising, letting them drift away. So I think the best meditation, quite frankly, is the one that you like doing and are consistently going to do long term, just
I'm
like
really
as long
glad
as you.
you said that, because for actually in order to get into it, I was
Mhm.
doing it wrong. Like they'll tell you not to lay down. You really shouldn't
Yeah,
lay down during meditation. But sitting up, like my back would start to hurt, and it is boring. It
yeah,
can be. I would challenge people. When was the last time you sat with the boredom and didn't glance at your phone? So that has inherent value anyway. But
yeah,
I was doing it wrong. But that was the way I could get it done. And when I came to, resonate with the feeling and enjoy it, I actually I came to want it to be better, and I started doing it right. Like I realized, I
right.
am more likely to fall asleep if I do this laying down. I'll try it sitting up, and it worked better. But I came into it like sort of, an indirect and incorrect way.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, particular schools of thought are probably stricter than others. Like I actually formally trained in Dzogchen, which is like a Tibetan Buddhist school of meditation, because they had a little, group outside of Harvard when I was a college student. And so, and yeah, maybe some of that comes from thousands of years of like, oh, okay, yeah, you're probably more likely to fall asleep if you do it this way. So there's probably some, like traditional lessons or truth in terms of what they say. But on the other hand, too, I think like part of it is like we have to kind of adapt to a modern society, practical reality. So maybe that's my kind of behavioristic point of view, which is like we actually know this from the dietary research, which is there are differences between diets like low carb versus low fat, but the differences between them actually pale in comparison to consistency. So by far, even if you pick any diet that's like not insane, I would question like actually a vegan diet, but that's a conversation for another time.
I'm with you.
But
I'm
any
with you.
reasonable diet, the consistency to that one sticks to it by far actually predicts health outcomes much more than the slight differences between them. So consistency is king when whether it's meditation or it's diet. Speaking of kind of stress, you kind of mentioned going from managing 20 people all the way up to 80 people, and then you can't even possibly remember all the different streams of work. I can imagine that being very stressful. For folks, it's just there's so much responsibility on your shoulders, and a lot of people who are coming to you. And I also imagine inevitably a lot of people issues come up, right? When you're managing like 100 people, 1% of them is going to have some disaster or some issues, or people are conflicting with one another. Tell me about how you manage that. Is there any like lessons that you can impart as a manager?
Sure. So absolutely, you're a million percent right. People always crave the more senior position because they imagine that you're going to spend all your time focused on matters of high level strategy, or you're
Hmm.
going to do, less bureaucratic type of work. I've never done more administrative work than I did as a CMO. At Shopify, I probably had close to 250 people under
Yeah,
me. And you're right. Every damn day, someone had an HR issue, someone felt that they weren't being treated fairly, and it's true that in aggregate, that's highly annoying. But I think that if you can view each person as an individual and empathize with how you'd be likely to feel in their shoes, then you take the time to spend with them. And so that sort of is. There's all sorts of structural things about managing to deliver an outcome. Managing in terms of the interpersonal sense, I think really comes down to having great empathy. I care a lot about people. I took very seriously the notion that you're probably not happy in your life if you're not happy in your job. You're going to spend 8 or 10 hours there a day. And insofar as I had some responsibility over whether people were going to be happy in their job, which had such an enormous bearing on whether they were happy in their life, I took very seriously the managerial role of making sure that people felt like they were aligned to the vision and plan in a way that was broader than the day to day tasks that they did, and that they
yeah,
saw how delivering against a set of objectives would lead to something bigger than themselves, and that they enjoyed doing that. And
yeah.
so that's the interpersonal part of management tips. There's all sorts of other stuff about how you divvy up an organization and how you delineate responsibility and authority and things like that. There's only one other I would add in the interest of brevity, too
Mhm,
late, which is you really have to back your deputies.
mhm.
If you have a number two in a certain area
Yeah,
and they approve a creative, and the person underneath them says, well, I just want to check with Jeff, or I just want to check with the CMO, or
yeah,
even if they don't, no one's double checking them, but you just stumble upon it and you say, you know what, that wasn't right, I'm going to change that. You've
mhm,
just created a rhythm where now everything comes to you. And
yeah,
so I found it much more valuable to back the lieutenants I put in place, and if they do
mhm,
something I really didn't like, I'll maybe tell them off to the side.
yeah,
But keeping the system working and not
mhm,
becoming the bottleneck yourself, whatever your high opinion of your own ideas and
right.
preferences is paramount.
Yeah, that's such a valuable piece of advice too, because I think in a lot of startups, they're almost there's this ethos of anti-hierarchialism, right? Which is like, oh, anyone can talk to anyone, and there's obviously a value there. Everyone, it's great for everyone to talk to the CMO or the CEO, but on the other hand, if they're subverting, their manager and making it so that you're managing 250 people, which is obviously totally not feasible, I can see where that creates a lot of issues.
And it's not mutually exclusive. I mean, everyone can be friends and be able to talk
Mhm.
to each other. Just when an important decision, comes up, the person whose sphere it's in, I really believe should be empowered to make that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very curious to me that you mentioned the word empathy too. I'm glad that you did because I do think it's absolutely critical in terms of the interpersonal part of being a great manager or executive. Do you think that's something that people are just born with? It's just a disposition, or have you seen, or in your personal experience, do you think it can be cultivated or developed?
I definitely know people, including people that I'm close to, who have cultivated certain parts of the interpersonal component of
Mm,
good management. It certainly helps if you're wired for parts of it.
sure.
You
Yeah.
know, I think you can get there, but there's a lot of people that I mentor, coach in different ways, and one of my observations has been you can absolutely get better in areas where you're weak. You can't fundamentally change who a person is or how they're
Hmm.
wired, nor should you necessarily want to. But it leads to
Right.
an interesting debate over whether we should seek to compensate for our weaknesses or actually strive to maximize our strengths.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that it's possible and you've seen it in your experience too. And I certainly have as well. Yeah, people aren't going to necessarily flip flop from being like fifth percentile to 95th percentile unless they're, I mean, it may be possible with a lot of concerted change, right? Like, for instance, a daily meditation routine, if there's a barrier to getting in the way of their empathy, right? Like, let's say they have an anger problem and mindfulness teaches them to at least, be able to feel the feeling, not react on automatically, certainly not blow up to a direct report. And that can make huge improvements in terms of how people, act and manage that. So I'm glad that we're conveying the message that it is absolutely possible to change.
It just takes
Um,
humility. You have to want to change,
yeah,
and
yeah,
wanting to change it means admitting that there's a part of you that isn't perfect. And I've also seen the flip side of this. I've seen people attain higher levels of power and wealth and really
hmm,
change.
hmm,
And I think and I've seen it a lot. And I find that very troubling. And I've seen them lose their empathy and forget how to treat human beings, and that absolutely can happen too.
yeah. Do you think there's a secret to kind of maintaining one's humility when everyone is, rewarding you, praising you, or you have sort of the power and wealth that almost is like a confirms one's ego?
That's a great question. That's absolutely the mechanism, is the notion that your great success confirms that every thing you did was correct, when in fact your success maybe could have been greater if you did some things differently, or
Mhm.
everyone does things well and things poorly, and the outcomes are a partial reflection of both. I think that my question is more the opposite, which is,
Mm.
you're sort of saying, how do you keep that? And I'm sort of wondering, how do you lose that? Like,
Yeah,
I
right.
have to. I mean, there are things that I consider so fundamentally human about other people's feelings that I don't actually know how you lose it. I suspect it has to do with, feedback loops where, because you accrue a certain amount of power, people
Mhm.
start yesing everything you do. That leads you to be, persuaded that you're either not, hurting them in some way, or that you're always right, which becomes
Right.
self-reinforcing. I think that cultivating an environment, I certainly as a leader strive to do this, although I can't say that everyone I've ever worked with has.
Sure. Sure.
Cultivating an environment where, like, tell me why I'm wrong,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I did get to a certain point where I realized that people were accepting my answer because I was senior to them.
Yep. Yep.
And particularly when I was in the realm of analytics, which was always a large part of my work, you're not right analytically because you're more senior or you've got a bigger
Sure.
title. And so I started asking people, like push back on this, tell me why I'm wrong,
Yeah.
and that was a good rhythm to build. But a lot of folks have just, people do lose that.
That is such a critical point. I think, especially in this day and age where we live in these echo chambers, whether it's in our organizations or in social media, right? It can be very easy to kind of have this confirmatory bias all the time of being right or being around people who reinforce the fact that you seem right. So
I've seen this a lot. I've seen this a lot in social media. Actually, an executive tweets a message, it gets
mhm,
retweeted, ad nauseum by their followers, and they say, "See, that was the right message." Well, obviously, there's a selection bias in the people who already follow you. They may not
sure,
be representative of the market at large, but that's a specific one in the social media landscape where there's often hard data to contradict it. But
right.
people have an incredible ability can have an incredibility to ignore the data, when their emotions tell them otherwise.
Totally, yeah. But I think your point about preventing that by extending the invitation to get feedback, especially negative or critical feedback from people. Um, uh, because we need to have someone point out that the emperor is not wearing any clothes or you didn't do something right. Because not only keeps us humble, but it keeps us accurate and aware of what's going on in the world around us. So I think that's a really, really helpful management tip. I thought it was really interesting that you also mentioned the importance of doubling down on your strengths, right? So I was kind of curious on that note, since you kind of advise, coach, mentor people. Are there kind of things along those lines that you suggest to people when they're thinking about how can I become more successful in my career? Are there principles like that?
I think this is maybe not quite in the vein of an answer to that specific question, but the
Mhm.
thing I most often find myself coaching people on is communication and narrative. So
Mm,
much about your performance in the workplace is about telling a story.
yep.
I'm in meetings all the time where people see people saying, well, this didn't work because, or, you know, um, oh, I have an idea. The best thing you can do to help yourself if you are working with an executive is have a
Mhm.
clear story. The
Mm,
results are X. I am going to take the following actions. Here's
mhm,
a model. I'm an analyst, but in my view, here's a model for how the results will change as a result of that. And that's
mhm,
how we hit our targets. If
mm,
those actions can't result in those targets, here are the additional resources and capabilities I need to be able to hit them. Here's what that will cost. But just
mhm,
having a clear story about what I'm here to do, what actions I will take, what results that will create for the company,
mhm.
and how that is consistent with the company's objectives and goals. Very few people actually have a narrative around that.
Totally.
And, I think it's really important to have one at any given time. You might have it on a given project or for this quarter, but there are a number of different spheres in which we should have what the story basically is and be able to communicate it clearly and concisely. I always felt that I had risen in the world of analytics, not because I could make a better model necessarily,
Mhm.
but because I could explain in lay terms what it was
Mm.
doing and why you should care and how it related to the business environment. And so just, so that to me, communication is really the thing.
Absolutely. There's a lot of people who are technically, quantitatively brilliant, but they cannot communicate that effectively. And it's a rare combination because it is kind of like, different kind of parts of our brain that convey that. But it's interesting to hear you almost go through that outline and that checklist of, a narrative that you would tell in a meeting or a boss. It almost sounds like common sense when you say it. But I go back and I think about the thousands of meetings that I've been, and I'm like, it's very rare that someone's actually presented every single one of those steps. But how nice it would be as a manager to hear them because it's like, oh, okay, this person is thorough, right? Is detail oriented as we're kind of, going full circle in our conversation in terms of thoroughness. And I would trust this person that they can handle it and do the right thing.
Yeah, I
So
also
that
made it
that's
sound I also made it sound way more formulaic than it needs to be with the,
yeah.
color of language behind it. It shouldn't sound so robotic. But, I would challenge people to have a narrative like that. And for managers, like, do you have that basic information, whether it was
Mhm.
conveyed in such a formulaic way or not?
By the way, do you think reading fiction has made you a better storyteller and communicator?
I don't, I actually view a certain form of communication, like what I just described, as more a facet of analytics, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Okay.
that was really, we're going to do X, it'll lead to Y, that'll result in Z. So, I don't think that has much to do with fiction. Fiction maybe gives you a good vocabulary. I think that could be part of the benefit.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I do want to circle back to something that we touched upon in part one, where you were talking about your investment in Maximus, and part of the thesis behind it was kind of community driven consumer company. So there's great examples of those. Glossier is kind of highlighted as one of those. Started out as a blog, which turned into a big cosmetics company. Bulletproof is also a great example of one that had a lot of books and podcasts before there was even a single product launched for years. What do you think that kind of makes the community driven model successful, or what have you seen work?
Yeah, I think it's about finding a strength of affinity between people, and having a common interest. That's you can't force it on people. You see it
Mm,
arise organically on Reddit or in other social media
yeah.
platforms, but I think that it has to be something that's fairly core to what people believe and that they think constitutes them. The way they define their self. That is in common with other people. And Maximus is clearly in a sphere that would have that. There are
Mhm.
other things that are incredibly frivolous where people aspire to build community. You make trying to think of a category we don't have an investment in. You
Yeah.
make pens, and like, they might be the greatest pens in the world, but what degree of emotional attachment are people really going to ascribe to them? How fundamental is it to their sense of self? And so,
Right.
something in that sphere that's a shared, belief or objective just seems to be the core of it.
Yeah, I see that with a lot of luggage brands, and they try to have community, and I'm like, maybe I would be very impressed if you can pull that off. I understand, like, I want to be an aspirational travel brand, lifestyle brand. Everyone does, but yeah, I think it can be hard to pull off. It takes a little bit of magic. But I'm glad that you mentioned Reddit. I actually always say, like, for aspiring entrepreneurs out there, if you're looking for business ideas, find a large successful subreddit, because that is an example of a community that people care about. And if there isn't a business around that, then think about how you could monetize that community, if you're going to pursue at least a community driven model. So
Yeah, I think people also sometimes fundamentally fail to ask themselves what has value to other people. The sort of like invite, a million friends and get $2 on your next pen. Like, that's obviously not going to work. Does that sound compelling? But there's
right.
a lot of models like that out there, that just to me don't really pass the common sense test.
Yeah, makes sense. And I love to hear your perspective, because you get such a wide breadth of the consumer landscape, all these emerging companies that you're obviously investing or working with. What excites you these days about consumer? What trends should whether it's consumers or entrepreneurs be kind of aware of? You're looking out 3, 5, even 10 years out.
That's a great question. I'm very interested outside of my day job, because I should park
Sure.
elements of that. I'm very interested in, commerce enablement.
Hmm.
Obviously, Shopify was my first lens
Yep.
into that, but you see a whole ancillary ecosystem of fulfillment providers that specialize in SMB, and Stripe on the payment side. And so this notion of the folks I've worked with at the IAB, the Interactive Advertising Bureau, coined the term the outsourced supply chain facilitating D2C
Hmm.
e-commerce. I love the B2B, really B to SMB
Hmm.
ecosystem that's growing up there. There's a lot of trends internationally that I think are really interesting. That we've been looking at, the live streaming models in China,
Yeah.
where they call it a KOL, a key opinion leader, that we would call almost like an influencer.
Right.
Is living their life and expressing a product, and there's commentary and engagement with it. It's sort of the modern day, home shopping network.
That's
And
right.
Amazon's got live streaming now, and there's social selling happening on Instagram. But I don't know that we've nailed the social selling, the social commerce model of
Hmm.
the future just yet. So that's one that I'm interested in and watching. And then I have my own geeky things. Like, I was a data driven marketer. To act on the
Hmm.
data, you need technology that interprets the data and creates customer facing experiences. And so, I follow very closely marketing technology, because, enabling that data to turn into customer experiences in an automated way at scale is
Hmm.
as much a tech challenge as it is a marketing challenge, and in a classical sense. And people always underestimate uh, how much data plumbing there is that needs to be done. But all that said, I follow marketing technology very closely, and I'm very interested to see who will build certain parts of it in the way that Shopify has for commerce. I think there are certain, almost like, this is an oversimplification, but like the Salesforce for SMB, isn't quite there in a dominating way like Shopify has for checkout.
For sure. I'm particularly curious. I mean, you get a nice vantage point through the, job that you have. Do you have advice for people on how they can, like you, even if they're, not an investor, or not kind of at like the forefront of the hottest companies, be aware of these trends, whether it helps them kind of pick the next big company to work for, as an employee, or if they're even investing their $600 stimulus check into the stock market in terms of where they should place their bets. How do you, even in your personal life, maybe, stay on top of these sort of marketing trends, and how can other people do the same?
I think we're fortunate to be living in a very open source world with respect to opinions.
Right.
And so I'm always shocked by the amount that people, especially on Twitter, but in social media, share about what they think. So, like, if you wanted to know what the trends were, you would do follow on research of your own, because of course you want your view of where something is headed to be differentiated from the masses. But
Hmm.
starting by following a handful of incredibly successful investors, your Peter Thiels of the world, or
Right.
whoever, and looking at not so much what their opinion is, but what the topics are that they're
Mhm.
interested in. And then if you can, you ask me how I do it. I've been fortunate to build up relationships in
Mhm.
different spaces over time, and just calling people up who work in a space. And by the way, it doesn't have to be the CEO. You might know a manager level person in ops at some company, but ask them like
Mhm.
what the big initiatives are. Ask them
Yep.
how that company sees the world. Most people will be surprised that if they set their mind to those kinds of relationships and creating some sort of news stream of opinion leaders they can value, can avail themselves of a lot of this information, I think.
Yeah, that's such a great piece of advice. It's amazing how even almost anyone who works at a company, they have such insight that maybe like well ahead of what the market sort of knows. And it's not obviously to go get insider information. That's not what we're
Yeah, no, of
advocating.
course not.
But you can certainly learn about sort of trends, cutting edge kind of things, because they're obviously very aware. They have an all hands meeting of different things that are going on, and so being almost like plugged into different nodes at different companies, especially companies that are that you respect or admire, can be a great way of getting sort of inside baseball, inside learning, that may turn out like 5, 10 years later in the market.
I'll add one, by the way, that I wasn't really, until I became an exec at public companies, I wasn't really aware of this, but analyst reports.
Yeah.
When analysts who cover, a stock for, an institution write about it, yes, they have to report the numbers and where is the business heading, but they often do so in the context of the drivers and the secular trends behind that industry. And so,
Mhm.
you might get a good amount just by reading the public filings of the company and the analyst reports around earnings time.
Yeah, absolutely. I very much recommend that to folks, whether it's deciding to obviously invest. I'm like, you should go read, as a company is going public, they put out reports, and the analysts do a good job of them. And so obviously you have to scrutinize them with your own lens, but you'll know more than 95% of people investing in a stock if you read the S1 or, some basic, analyst reports about it. So I think it's a good practice, especially for anyone who wants to level up, whether they're working in the business world or they're just kind of a retail investor.
Yeah, and I would add one thing for anyone who wants to be broadly informed about business. Learn how to read a P&L, income statement, balance sheet, like
Mm.
just being basically versed in the language of communicating business results, I think is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also glad that you mentioned kind of following key kind of investors or thought leaders in the space. I think it's so easy on social media to follow so many people, and so one of the things I actually advocate is quality over quantity. I'm like, you should minimize, in fact, the number of people that you follow, in my opinion, and you really curate that list to have it be like people that you think are actually put out very thoughtful. It's not just spammy content or random things, but you feel like you're actually learning and deriving value from, and actually maximize the amount of content that you get from them. Because yeah, if you're listening to a Peter Thiel, I was listening to Eric Weinstein talk yesterday. He's obviously a very public intellectual. I find him very thoughtful about, even if I don't agree with him all the time. There's a lot of value that you get from listening to someone who's very thoughtful or spent a lot of time in a space. Even 5, 15 minutes with them it feels like it's worth many hours of your own research to kind of come to similar conclusions.
Yeah, and publications too. I don't think it has to be individuals. If I look at my own Twitter stream, it's
Hmm.
usual suspects: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, name them. I'm having trouble naming them, but Salon,
Yeah.
what have you. But the Atlantic, the Economist, publications that put out good content will keep you pretty well apprised.
For sure. And switching gears a little bit, because we were talking about community, and obviously our community is around sort of helping men be better through kind of mutual improvement. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or an opinion about what makes a good man in your opinion or your experience.
It's such an interesting question. I think that we've been trained in a certain way. Everything you shouldn't say about gender,
Uh-huh.
because it's become a bit of a minefield. And frankly, if I was still a public company executive, I'd be sort of pre-thinking what I'm going to say
Yeah,
in a way that I'm clearly
fair enough.
not. But for fear of offending people, I think in this day and age, there isn't much at least on paper, that separates being a good man from being a good person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Evolutionary traits like greater strength, greater height don't confer too much advantage in the modern world of computers and thinking work.
Sure.
That said, I think there are certain atavistic qualities that we associate with maleness.
Mm-hmm.
Protecting your family, being a pillar of strength and reliable in the way that we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Treating women really well, something I'm much
Absolutely.
more attuned to since I live in a household with three women,
Right.
and taking great care not to limit them,
Mm-hmm.
and even not only not limiting them but proactively correcting for bad tendencies you might see, like when you're in the meeting and you just
Mm-hmm.
are you attuned to whether the white men are doing all the speaking,
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
and asking it, well, so and so, do you have an opinion, to
Yep.
the woman in the room. So I think just I think it's that element of protection and care and providing and reliability, but also empowering women if they don't already feel 100% on an equal footing, to
Hmm.
make sure
Mm-hmm.
that they do, because they're on paper shouldn't be anything that prevents the genders from equally availing themselves of anything at this point.
Sure, absolutely. It's such an interesting insight that you share too about sort of like some of these traits, especially in the knowledge worker era, right? Like we're no
That's the
longer
word I was
hunter,
looking for.
hunting and gathering. They may not be important. In fact, intelligence and conscientiousness are probably the two traits that are most predictive of success in the modern era, right? Which have nothing to do with, size or strength. Do you think some of these maybe more traditional or classic masculine virtues, whether it's sort of strength or courage or honor, mastery, do they have relevance? And if they do, where can we apply them if it's not putting bread on the table, so to speak?
By the way, I love what you said about being a knowledge worker, which was really the word I was looking for. And I think there is pretty good evidence that women are turning out to be better global political leaders. So in the
That may
knowledge
be.
sphere, there may be places where they have not only are not disadvantaged but are substantively advantaged. I happen to think, this is my own opinion, that
Sure.
on an evolutionary timeline, we're not that far away from a period when things like height and strength and the literal, providing of bread on the table would have conferred an advantage. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's hard for me to believe that our intellectual disposition has changed much. In
Yeah.
evolutionary time, I'm guessing you'd need, you're the doctor, you tell me, at least tens of thousands of years.
Right.
Right.
But we're no more than 100 years from being knowledge workers, and so it seems to me, virtually impossible that we have intellectually evolved in our intentions and attitudinal makeup from a time when traditional notions of masculinity would have actually conferred an advantage.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think we're probably wired to, assign gender value in ways that are outmoded, but have to be hardwired to some extent. That would be my guess. That may be a controversial statement. It's so hard to even keep track these days of what you're supposed to say and not. So the best way is just to
Yeah.
say what you think.
No, I think the challenge is like there's probably like multiple forces that are pushing at the same time. Where you're right, I think certainly in terms of one's professional success, those traditional virtues may not be as important. If you're talking about the dating marketplace, it may be sort of it's interestingly different. Where I think because of women's economic empowerment, ironically, one of the trends that I've seen is they don't need to, because someone doesn't need to rely on someone as much as a provider per se. Ironically, I think they kind of go back to some of those traits where I've never seen actually height emphasized so much, especially due to online dating, where like now 6 foot is a new requirement, even though less than 20% of men are over 6 feet tall. But there's a lot of women that are like actually putting the pressure on and saying this is my standard. I can provide for myself. So, but let me get the whatever physical ideal that I want. So it's a very interesting moment, I think, in our cultural history where there's all these different forces at play, and kind of the demands that it elicits, puts, I think, both men and women in kind of an awkward place. We don't know exactly what we want or what's optimal.
Yeah, well, I think that maybe, I think that notion of striving for something that is not only, outmoded, but sort of runs contrary to what the current thinking is, may be a result of this disconnect between our evolutionary wiring, and what matters in point of fact in this day and age. So,
Mhm.
to use that example, the woman who's only seeking a man over 6 feet tall probably intellectually knows that, very few men meet that standard, or that, doesn't confer any real world advantage these days. But you know what? She finds it attractive.
Right.
And that would be, something genetically hardwired, or, I don't know if it's genetic, but it would be hardwired in any event, because it
Right.
would have correlated with, survival of one's offspring in the past. And so,
Right.
it seems to me that on an intuition basis, evolutionary biology has a lot of merit to it. But I
Right.
feel like it has been, there are also circles, I think, that have discredited it because it can lead to what seems to be the reinforcement of stereotypes.
For sure, for sure. By the way, you mentioned Peter Thiel earlier. One of his favorite questions that I like to ask folks is, what important truths, or maybe just even one truth, do very few people agree with you on?
I haven't floated this to too many people, so I don't know who agrees with this. But one of my governing thoughts about the world is what I've sort of dubbed like the no one knows anything theory. And at its root, the no one knows anything theory is about the fact that problems are so much more multivariate than we can give them credit for, and outcomes are so much less predictable or attributable than we might want them to be. That I think that, I'll tell you when this notion took root. I was having all sorts of back problems, maybe 10 years ago, that I don't have anymore, and I went to a back doctor, and he wanted to operate.
Mm.
And then I went to a different kind of back doctor, and he wanted to give me injections in the epidural space. Then I went to a physical therapist, and they want me to do certain exercise. So first of all, everyone was a hammer in search of a nail.
Totally.
But at the end of the day, I ended up learning some hip flexor and IT band stretches, and all my back problems went away. And I had seen all these experts, and I sort of, for one thing, you've got this attribution problem where you're probably going to credit the last thing that worked. For all I know, the stretches isn't what fixed my back. Time had elapsed, right? Maybe time had elapsed since the injury, but you're going to, everyone's sort of on a last touch attribution in marketing speak, for events like that in their life. But, I'd seen all these experts, they all had a different opinion. And it was a much more multivariate problem than anyone could really solve. Ditto for a business succeeds or fails. You might have been doing well selling, rides to work for commuters. Well, when COVID hit, so it's a mix, I guess, of not just that the world is more multivariate with interacting causal factors than we perceive, but it's a mix of that and that so much randomness and arbitrariness comes in to to ruin best laid plans. And so I just sort of like, no one knows anything, no one knows where anything's going, and that applies to a lot of forms of expertise.
Totally. No, it's a great point. I actually, ironically, used to do a lot of pain management work throughout my training, and in the end, we sort of concluded that a multidisciplinary pain management program was the best. You literally have someone march through and see all of them: the doctor, the psychologist, the physical therapist, and they give them their best spiel, and the patient kind of picks and chooses and decides, any and all that they do, because it's
And I
probably
wonder
the
if
best.
they're mutually reinforcing, or if that's just a way of acknowledging that no one knows anything
Yeah,
theory,
yeah.
and one of them's likely to work, but we don't really know which. I wonder if that's
Totally.
a tacit acknowledgement of the theory.
Yeah, it may be. So I got a great final question for you, and you've been super generous with your time, and a lot of interesting and deep insights, which is kind of based on this "no one knows everything" theory. So let's suppose this is true, and it also harkens to kind of what we were talking about. We're in this crazy complex modern society where we have these traits and hardwired preferences that may not have evolved. So given all this, what advice would you give to kind of a young man in terms of decision making, which is, I know, an area of interest of yours? Like, how does one, make decisions, whether it's about their personal life, their career, how to be a better man, when there is all this information that's being bombarded at them, and no one, quite frankly, may know anything or have the right answer?
A few things. One, I would say, this is one of those things that gets better as you age. I think it's like
Mm.
relax, not that much. There's a framework for this type 1 and type 2 decisions, and it has to do with reversibility. And I don't remember, but very few things can't be reversed.
Mm.
So and you don't know, even if the near term consequences of a decision are what you wanted or are not what you wanted. You don't really know what the longer term consequences of any decision will be. So, given that you really don't know, this is sort of consistent with the no one knows anything theory, where each thing is going to, bring you, especially when you think 2, 3, 4 steps out, and the fact that most things are reversible. I would advise everyone, however much you're stressing, stress less.
Yeah.
Is certainly that's probably my biggest piece of advice is, very few things are forever. And here's one I'll add. I think pros and cons lists are overrated.
Mm.
I've really done the best when I've had a list of all these pros and they seem to dwarf the list of cons, but my
Yeah.
gut told me no. If I went ahead because of the list, I was almost always proved wrong. And
Sure.
over my life, not that I'm some old man, but I'm in my 40s. As I've gotten older, relying on intuition more and
Mm.
more has led to better results for me. It may be that your intuition becomes better honed,
Mhm.
through a feedback loop of experience and results. But nonetheless, I would just say, analytically coming to decisions where your own life is concerned, when you have, the perfect meter in your gut,
Mhm.
is probably overrated.
Absolutely. I actually call intuition unconscious pattern recognition, essentially. And it is, I think it's kind of your brain's model that is trained in a lot of ways very analytically over time. And so people sort of disregard it. And I think it's partly because also people confuse sort of emotions with intuition. There's a difference between sort of your gut feeling versus a passing anxiety that people have. And I think that's part of wisdom, is to understand the difference between the two. But I love what you said about, in a world in which no one knows anything, or is really the expert on everything, um, that instead of causing sort of anxiety about that, then maybe that's actually a signal that we can relax a little bit, in that you're not alone, certainly in that feeling. And to your point, you can always reverse it. There's always an escape. So great. And in my opinion, optimistic point of view. So, Jeff, thank you so much. Ton of wisdom that you've shared, as an entrepreneur, as an investor, as a father, and I would argue, a good role model as a man to our community and our audience and the world at large. Thank you so much for sharing some of your personal stories, which I think is incredibly valuable in having people relate to you. And is there any shout out or anything that you want to add at the end of the podcast in terms of, I don't know how much you engage on social media these days, or any resources for folks to follow up on?
No, I'm not a very, thank you for having me, by the way.
Sure,
This was
sure.
great fun. And I think, you asked really thought provoking questions that, I think are, it's hard to have pre-processed them. So you get a very real response. I think that will do well in this series, of podcasts. I'm a relatively private person. One of the things I struggled with, as I became more senior and I was encouraged
Mhm.
to give speeches, and, I got to a point where I could do it for my department or my company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I have trouble. I feel, for myself personally, not judging anyone
Yeah.
else, that there's a lot of, I feel too much hubris in telling the world, here's what you should think. And so I'm certainly loath to use, social media platforms to dispense with advice or anything like that. But yeah, follow me on Twitter. I'll retweet something.
Yeah. That sounds good. Well, maybe that's the final lesson, in fact, for our audience. I think there is actually a great deal of pressure for up and coming, or I would say early career professionals, to do a lot of personal branding and self promotion. I think that can work if you're actually doing it with a very particular purpose. Ironically, I was talking to Dave Asprey about this, because I was like, I'm an introvert. Do I want to kind of follow in your footsteps and be kind of a public figure? And he actually shared a really interesting anecdote with me. He was like, dude, I was the most anonymous guy ever. I erased my presence online. I was like, I didn't want to be an influencer, but I realized in order to make Bulletproof successful, that's kind of what that model required. And then he became Dave Asprey, the Bulletproof executive.
And if you were to extract that, I think you would say that what can force you over that line is having something you care about that's greater than, your sense of nervousness, or whatever it is, or shame, being a public figure. For me, I was always able to do it within a department, because I
Mhm.
knew it was important to rally people behind a vision. But telling an anonymous public, like, that's a line for me, for Dave. it was obviously important enough to him, for his vision of Bulletproof to be realized, that overcame his skittishness. So I think it's like sort of what you believe in that's bigger than yourself.
Absolutely, and that's exactly why I'm doing this with Maximus. I'm like I like being an operator, being an academic, being anonymous, quite frankly. But I'm very compelled by this mission of helping men and be better in mind and body, and so this is why we're doing these podcasts. But I think you're also a good role model as well, in the sense that you can be a tremendously successful and effective executive without necessarily being self-promotional. So hopefully, we're introducing the world to different models, and that people can kind of pick and choose which is based on their strengths and their values. So thank you, Jeff, for having, for being on our podcast. I think it's contributed a great deal of value to our community. And thank you for also being an investor and supporting us directly as well.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. It was fun being with you, and I'm so psyched for what the future will bring for Maximus.
Thank you. Thank you very much.